If hunting down Atlantis is a bit of you, then you're going to want to know about these updates. A man called George Serentius, he is a Greek academic. He is an expert in a lot of ancient texts. He's done work on the Iliad, the Odyssey. His work has been recognized by the Greek Academy, and he has gone through and done a deep dive on Plato's ancient texts, not just retranslating the ancient Greek texts into English, because he did discover that there's been a lot of mistranslations over the centuries from the ancient text to English, but he also deep dived into all of Plato's works and cross-referenced all of the algorithms, the themes, the grammatical caveats, and realized that there's quite a bit of difference between what we have today in the English modern translation and the original text. So strap in, here we go. I already did a video on my feed about the historical context of the Pillars of Heracles, because from the Roman Empire onwards, about 117 AD, that is when collectively everybody agreed that the Strait of Gibraltar could be known as the Pillars of Heracles. But going back into history, there is other ancient texts that reference the Pillars of Heracles, or Pillars of Hercules, or more correctly, the Stellas of Heracles, like a physical stone boundary mark. They were actually at other locations, and looking at other texts like Herodotus, he places the Pillars of Heracles on the other side. This is the Mediterranean Sea up here. That is the the modern day Strait of Gibraltar. He puts the Pillars of Heracles historically on the Gulf of Gabes, which is now kind of like modern day Tunisia. And inside the Gulf of Gabes, if you go back thousands of years into the wet Sahara, it would have opened into a sea, and loads of tributaries and rivers, basically kind of like a modern day Amazon jungle, completely navigable by boat. Anyway, already did a video on that. This video is about the mistranslations in the Plato's text about the word ocean and sea, and how it's very different in the Greek to the English, and it makes a difference. So in the Greek language, they have way more words than we do in the English language for things. So for example, we just have ocean and sea, and they can kind of be interchangeable. However, when you put them in context, like when we say like the Mediterranean Sea or the Black Sea, they are very different seas to the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, because they're enclosed or entirely surrounded by land, etc., etc. So context matters, and names and specific words really, really matter in translation. So in the Greek, in Greek, you have 4 words, ancient words, for oceans and seas, and they all reference very specific things. So you've got Oceanos, which is like ocean. Pacific Ocean, a huge, massive ocean of water. Again, we can all agree kind of what ocean means. Then you've got 3 words that can mean sea, and have different contexts. So you've got Thalassa, which is like the Mediterranean Sea. So it is a sea in its own right, and it's surrounded by various continents. Then you've got a Pelagos, which is like the Aegean Sea today, which is just up from sort of Crete and Greece. It's a sea that has many, many, many little islands, and is often surrounded by like a peninsula of continent. Hold that thought. Peninsula of continent, many, many, many islands. And then you have a Pontos, which is like the Black Sea, which is a sea that is surrounded entirely by continent, almost like a massive, massive lake, a Pontos. So in the Plato's text, what words does he use? He never says Atlantic Oceanos. He never says out of the Atlantic Ocean came the kingdoms of Atlantic and the Atlantean people. He doesn't. He says out of the Atlantic Pelagos. Pelagos, that was the one which was a sea with many, many little islands surrounded by like a peninsula of continent. Okay? Very different. There is a different here. Here is a little wee example. So if the Pillars of Heracles were actually in the Gulf of Gabes on the other side of North Africa, and it was an entryway into what would be described as an Atlantic Pelagos, and it would be an Atlantic Pelagos because from the Greek side of things, it's on the Atlantic side of things. Do you see what I mean? And any ancient civilization, community, culture that was living around the wet green Sahara and navigating all of the waterways and the seas and the tributaries and the rivers that were in North Africa at the time and coming out of the Pillars of Heracles and into the Mediterranean to fight people, trade, whatever. Suddenly that's very, very different. Okay. So here we got a wee little quote. The writings refer to how mighty was the force that marched in arrogance at the same time against all of Europe and Asia that campaigned out of the Atlantic Pelagos. Not the Atlantic Ocean, the Atlantic Pelagos. And also the words out of, from Greek to English, in the same way that we say this here, that there. We are like referencing, like there's a context as into to where it is. In the same way, in the Greek, ancient Greek text, out of references something inside that's coming out of. And if it's coming from inside somewhere and out to somewhere else, it made sense with the boundary line being of the Gulf of Gabes. Did that make sense? Probably not. But are you with me? This is very exciting information because we historically have always taken the geographical location of Atlantis from the modern English translation, which says out of the Atlantic Ocean, off the pillars of through the Pillars of Heracles. But what if the Pillars of Heracles were the ancient Pillars of Heracles and not the Roman Pillars of Heracles, the Strait of Gibraltar? We always pin it from the Strait of Gibraltar. And what if we got that wrong? What if it's referencing an older, way, and it would make sense, it's way, way older. If the Pillars of Heracles in 9,600 BC, maybe they're not the same ones. Anyway, there we are today. I hope you like my TED Talk. Atlantic Ocean does not appear in the original Plato text for Atlantis. You're welcome.